We have two experts here with us to discuss the evolving situation. Dan Perry is an Israeli affairs analyst, the former regional editor of the Associated Press in the Middle East, and Tamer Qarmout, associate professor of public policy at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Dan will be with you in just a moment to talk more about what's happening in Israel. But Tamer, if we can begin with where things stand in Gaza and any hope for an end to the hostilities, Netanyahu saying that he'll only negotiate with Hamas under fire now. Does he want to negotiate with them at all, do you think?
He wants until he gets to release the Israeli captives, and then again back to point zero. I mean, he's only focused on releasing the captives, but he's still committed to achieving the goals, which is the main goals: eradicating Hamas and getting it out of the Gaza Strip. So I believe that Israelis and Americans are still committed to the same goals. There have been no change, a drastic change in their political stand. Although we have seen some political maneuvering, political initiatives, diplomacy, mainly focus or coming from Arab countries who want to see an end of this conflict. But so far, the Israelis are really not paying any attention or disregarding, in fact, these proposals.
The reinstating of Itamar Ben-Gvir, what does that tell us about the calculations that Netanyahu is making? How much is he being driven by domestic politics, and how much is he being driven by wanting to, as we were hearing from Tamer, eliminate Hamas? That is also part of the domestic political calculation, of course, but there doesn't seem to be any external pressure on Netanyahu at the moment.
That's correct. I mean, there are a number of things happening here. First of all, the government was never comfortable with the deal that implicitly enabled Hamas to remain in power, and they would have said that that was essentially signed under duress, under pressure from Trump. Now, the second thing is that same Trump is now allowing them to walk away from the deal. Because that's just the way he rolls. And with Trump, a deal is never a deal, but an opening position in the next negotiation going back to the 70s when he was a real estate developer. Third, there really is a political problem for Netanyahu. I mean, he has to pass a state budget by March 31st, so the government automatically falls. For that, he needs the solid support, and he gets that with Itamar Ben-Gvir rejoining the coalition. Fourth, in general, there is a lot of suspicion in Israel that Netanyahu is motivated by his need to continue the conflict because that enables him to stall on the establishment of an inquiry commission that about 80% of the people are demanding into the debacle and failures of October 7th. Look, Netanyahu is obsessed with staying in power. The deal, if fully implemented, would have desperately endangered his coalition, even beyond the budget issue. And the return of Itamar Ben-Gvir strongly suggests that he's doubling down on the current direction of things, which is to resume.
Well, Tamer, what can change the situation then, other than U.S. pressure, and what can lead to that U.S. pressure? Can the Arab leaders that came up with a counter-proposal, and especially Saudi Arabia, who Donald Trump wants to have a very good relationship with, what can they do now?
So, Elizabeth, I mean, the U.S. has vast interests in this region, and it also has key allies besides Israel as well. I think Trump is keen to achieve some progress on normalization deals between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The Saudis have been very clear from the onset that they will not go this path until they see a commitment in return, or a commitment to a political path to create a Palestinian state. Trump is coming to visit this month. There are some business deals, and he also, I'm pretty much sure that they will discuss also the Arab proposal, because Saudi is a key holder for this proposal. So I would be surprised if he comes with empty hands.
Dan, do you think that Netanyahu does have an end game? And when Tamer talks about how, you know, until this window of opportunity that Saudi Arabia, that Arab countries might present, what is Netanyahu planning to do with the free reign he seems to have until we see that pressure from Arab countries?
I think Netanyahu is obsessed with staying in power, but he's also pragmatic, and currently his political landscape tells him he has to continue the war. It's not, however, simply for that. There is support in Israel for eliminating Hamas in Gaza. I believe there's great support among the Palestinians for that. It's just that the war has failed to achieve it. And the reason why Israelis basically support an end to the war is because they notice that Netanyahu himself does not appear to be actually engineering a day-after plan without Hamas, because the same far right that prevents the implementation of the deal is also preventing a discussion of that, because the only plausible outcome is some alternate Palestinian leadership, and they would instead want permanent Israeli occupation. So Netanyahu, given his current coalition, is very much hamstrung. However, if the regional and international landscape changes, then that calculus could change as well.
Arab leaders have said that they are working on a plan for Hamas to step aside, for another Palestinian entity to take over. But just quickly, Dan, is there any Palestinian entity that would be acceptable to this Israeli government? They don't want Hamas, they don't want the Palestinian Authority either.
I think the Palestinian Authority, rejuvenated, revamped, working hand in hand with the Emiratis and the Qataris and the Saudis and the Egyptians, would be very hard for the government, for Israel to refuse. The pressure from the street would be overpowering. I kind of agree that the current government is not a partner for anything in Israel, but it would compel Netanyahu to realign, and the Israeli opposition would support it, and it would make clear that they would support it, and that would create a different environment. But for this to happen, the Arab countries have to go a little bit beyond the existing Egyptian plan, which is a step in the right direction. I think they simply have to tell Hamas, the game is over, you have no legitimacy, you'll have no funding, you'll have no escape unless you take the deal that's on the table with exile for your leadership and a disarming of the militia. You have to do this, otherwise the blockade continues. Who knows, the war may continue, but the alternative, the Palestinians, is extremely promising because of all the aid, because of all the assistance, and because of the forcing, the compelling of a political change in Israel.
I think letting go of arms will only come if there is a clear path for a Palestinian state that could be disarmed, no problem. Palestinians can take the justice proposal, but it has to come with a commitment from the Israelis that they will not reject such thing, allowing a Palestinian state to be established. And I think without this commitment, without the political vision to end this conflict, it will be hard to ask any party to let down of weapons. It's just hard, because this is a resistance movement for people, for a nation under occupation. And that's something Israel has to realize as well.
Tamer, Qarmout and Dan Perry, thank you both very much for your analysis. We appreciate it. Thank you. We have two guests with us to discuss the evolving situation. Dan Perry is an Israeli affairs analyst and the former regional editor of the Associated Press in the Middle East. He's live for us. He's live for us in Tel Aviv. And H.A. Hellyer is a senior fellow in geopolitics, international security and Middle East studies at the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you very much to both of you. Mr. Hellyer, I'll start with you in Cairo. Netanyahu said that he's only going to negotiate with Hamas now under fire. What are Hamas's current strengths and capabilities? How much more war can they withstand?
Thank you for having me on the program. I think what we've seen over the past, almost 18 months now, have been at various degrees of intensity. Israel trying to nullify Hamas as a military entity in Gaza. And it's done so by an incredibly aggressive and brutal campaign on Gaza. And we haven't seen Hamas collapse. On the contrary, Antony Blinken, just before he ended his term as Secretary of State, said that Hamas had basically replenished their numbers of people that were willing to fight for them as a result of this campaign on Gaza.
Mr. Perry, you think that Netanyahu believes he can force Hamas out of Gaza using military means? And to H.A. Hellyer's point about how their resources, the fighters' resources have been depleted, but they can make up the numbers. What can numbers alone, how much can numbers alone withstand without the weapons, without the technology?
I think Netanyahu does believe that he degraded Hamas significantly. It's true that they may have replenished many of their cadres, I don't know if the same number or almost the same, but they have a lot of people. But it's not the same quality of people. These are not the same fighters who were trained for years and years, had the weapons that they did. Hamas is undoubtedly degraded. Whether Netanyahu believes he can force to step down through military means, I cannot say. It is not irrelevant that that hasn't happened in almost a year and a half of fighting. But the fundamental paradox in Israel with this government is that even though they say that they want to remove Hamas from power, and that has overpowering support in Israeli public opinion, and I would argue also across the Arab world, I have to think, he hasn't taken action that would bring that about. Because if you're going to really engineer such a situation, you allow the creation of an alternative to Hamas. Even if Hamas were to give up today, it isn't clear what would come in their place. The default option of an Israeli military occupation, certainly one that is permanent, is very unpopular in Israel, hated by the security establishment, would be
by the security establishment. But what about the government and those in the government who aren't open to an alternative to Hamas? Because there are some who want to resettle Gaza itself, who do want to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza, from the occupied West Bank too.
Look, this government has no strategic plan, as my fellow panelist suggested. The strategic plan of Netanyahu seems to be that he should somehow cling to power as long as possible, and the next election isn't planned until October 2026. It's true that there are some in Israel that want those things, but it's a small minority. Nonetheless, tragically, for Israel, for the Palestinians, for the region and the world, that small minority of Israeli far right-wingers does control the fate of Netanyahu's coalition. I doubt Netanyahu wants a Jewish settlement of Gaza, nor believes that it can be ethnically cleansed. He is fundamentally, whatever else can be said of him, he lives in the Euclidean universe. But his government constrains him for sure. And part of the equation as of January 21st is that there no longer is a force in the White House that necessarily would impede a forever war in Gaza.
Let me bring Mr. Hellyer in there. Do you think that the Netanyahu government, not constrained by his coalition, are there any constraints on him now by this Trump administration?
So constraints wouldn't be the word that I would use. I would say that the relationship between the White House and Tel Aviv today is somewhat different. Because on the one hand, you have someone in the White House who isn't going to start talking about putting limitations on what type of weapons can go. And in broader terms, I think Tel Aviv feels very empowered to do what it sees fit when it comes not only to Gaza, but with regards to Syria, less so with regards to Lebanon, but certainly with regards to Gaza. If there were any breaks, I'm not convinced that there were, there certainly aren't any right now.
H.A. Hellyer in Cairo and Dan Perry in Tel Aviv. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you both very much for your analysis. We appreciate it.